Hello, this is Pat Speer. In 2014, I made a presentation on the single bullet theory in Bethesda, Maryland, and the video did not turn out very well. So this is my attempt to make things make it easier to follow what I was talking about and some of the information I presented. The title of my presentation is Single Bullet Theory, Voodoo Science, and Zombie Lies. Obviously, it's about the John F. Kennedy assassination, and we need to define what we're talking about here. The single bullet theory is the theory that one bullet struck President Kennedy and John Connally, and that theory was needed to sell that there was just but one assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. And voodoo science is science that is not genuine science, that is inaccurate for various reasons. And zombie lies are lies that just won't go away. And so I put those three together and came up with the title in honor of Mr. Arlen Specter, who, till his very end, who died a few years ago, insisted that the single bullet theory was the proper solution to the crime, and it was the proof that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. The problem is that almost every step of the single bullet theory has fallen into disfavor in scientific circles, or just doesn't make sense to begin with. Starting with the fact that the bullet didn't actually enter President Kennedy's body. The doctors at the autopsy found just a small entrance in the back that did not go into the muscle tissue below that for any depth. And but that didn't stop Specter from saying that it did. And for the rest of his life, starting with the Warren Commission, he started saying that the bullet slipped between two muscles on the back. But this is a misunderstanding of what the doctors had told him, that there was bruised muscles on the front of the neck. And then Arlen Specter started telling everybody there was bruised muscles on the back of the neck. This is something he just made up. And when you follow through his career, you can see how it spread. He just kept repeating it till the end. And then other people like Vincent Bugliosi, who also recently left us, he repeated it. So most people believe it's true. The bullet passed between two muscles, slipped between two muscles, but it did not. In fact, the area where the bullet impacted is the trapezius muscle on the back, and there's just a single muscle. And the strap muscles are on the throat. So that's one problem with the Specter's theory. Another one is that it didn't actually hit Kennedy on the neck, as Specter said, but it hit him on the back. And it's just proved at the autopsy, where Dr. J. Thornton Boswell marked what's called a face sheet, and he put the back wound on the back exactly where it was by the measurements. And the throat wound was higher on the drawing than in the back. Well, this was a problem because the bullet supposedly was fired from 6 floors up. So this was something that was mentioned by Joseph Ball and David Bellin, two members of the Warren Commission staff, who were tasked with trying to explain how the bullet could be fired from above and enter Kennedy's back and then exit his throat. Meanwhile, Counsel Norman Redlich was having some problems of his own, trying to keep the commission from pre-interviewing witnesses. This is something he thought would create a deceptively clean record, and he was fighting actively against it. But these two factors came together on Tuesday, March 10th. Chief Justice Warren complained that the witnesses they were getting were not substantive enough, in which they were all witnesses who were saying things that could indicate that there was more than one shooter, and this was a problem. So he insisted that they run out and start interviewing more substantive people, including the autopsy doctors, right away. And this actually came to pass. And not only that, Warren basically ruled against Norman Redlich and said that he was ready to receive a completely clean record, and he didn't want the staff to pursue inconsistencies. He wanted them to pre-interview witnesses and just put on the dog and pony show. Anyhow, so the very next day, Joe Ball and Arlen Specter decided to go out to Bethesda, Maryland, and interview the autopsy doctors. In Specter's memo on that, he says that he tried to get them to show how the single bullet trajectory worked, or the and notably he mentions that when they lined it up, the bullet exited the chest, and and that it entered the back and exited the chest. Anyhow, but a few days later, when the autopsy doctors testified, they brought in some drawings that Ball and Specter had asked them to create, and these showed the bullet entering on the back of the neck, and exiting from the throat, which is precisely what the doctor ordered, so to speak. But the problem is that the autopsy measurements show that the back wound was 14 centimeters down from the base of the skull, and the drawings didn't recreate that at all. And Dr. Humes testified that he gave the artist Skip Rydberg, who made these drawings, these measurements, but that was not true. And Rydberg later would talk about it and complain that he wasn't given the wound locations. And it's actually worse than that. That strangely, in Dr. Humes' testimony, he claimed that the autopsy protocol that they made out on the day of the autopsy, or a few days after the autopsy rather, identified a wound in the low posterior neck, but it actually said it was the upper thorax. And sure enough, several times in his testimony, Dr. Humes mentions low neck, low neck, low neck. And that was a huge problem with this, in that the clothing of President Kennedy the bullet entered way low below the bullet hole on the drawings. And so Dr. Arlen Specter asked Humes to try to explain this, and he made up this story about Kennedy being extremely muscular and extremely well developed, and how when he raised his hand to wave, it lifted the jacket way up. And this continues to this day. People tell the story. But Specter never believed it, because he wrote a memo on April 30th, 1964, where he once again referred to the wound as a hole in the president's back, and he said that they needed to look at the autopsy photos to confirm that the bullet wound was indeed in the back or in the neck where the drawing showed it. And he wanted to clear this up, to his credit, because he knew that someday someone would take a look at these autopsy photos and it could be trouble. And sure enough, it became trouble for him. On May 24th, they finally got a reenactment of the assassination, and they showed Secret Service agent Thomas Kelly showed Arlen Specter the autopsy photo of the back, and they marked it, and they also looked at the clothing, and they marked a chalk mark on the back of the stand-in in that location. And as you can see by the photo published in the New York Times, that the trajectory didn't line up because the bullet did not exit from the throat. And this was confirmed yet again when they lined up Kennedy and Connally in the car, and they took pictures from the sniper's nest, a supposed sniper's nest, and the bullet entering Kennedy in the back would have went on to hit Connally in the low back and not in the armpit, as the single bullet theory proposed. And this became a big problem. And not only that, the timing of the rifle and the Zapruder film, which they were comparing all this to, indicated that the bullet that hit Kennedy and must have hit Connally, or there would have to have been more than one shooter. So they were under a lot of pressure to make it all work. And then after the reenactment, Specter went to a warehouse, and he tried it again, and he got a trajectory rod representing the angle from the sniper's nest, and he lined it up with Connally's armpit and Kennedy's throat wound, and it passed inches above Kennedy's back wound. And so this is something that they had to make go away. And so a couple days later, he took Thomas Kelly's testimony, and they pretended like they never used the chalk mark on the back wound. They pretended that it was on the back of the neck, and they said that they used the Rydberg drawing, which shows it on the back of the neck, to create the chalk mark. And then they turned around and asked FBI agent Lyndall Schoenfeld to testify, and he said that rather than enter a photo showing the chalk mark, they had him testify that the trajectory approximated the back wound, and then they published the photo from the front, hiding the chalk mark from everybody. And then in the chapters that Specter submitted for the Warren Report, he repeatedly called the back wound a neck wound, neck, over and over again. And this is something Gerald Ford got blamed for, but it was actually Arlen Specter who was the one who changed it to from a back to a neck. And even after going back and reviewing the autopsy photos again before his 2000 book, A Passion for Truth, Specter once again decided in his autobiography to call it a neck wound over and over again. This brings us to Governor Connolly's wrist wound, which was another problematic wound for the single bullet theory. Because the testimony of Dr. Alfred Olivier, who performed tests for the Warren Commission and testimony was taken by Specter, indicates they studied the wounds and they tried to recreate them and study how much velocity would have been lost in a bullet because they were trying to show that the single bullet theory worked. And here on the left is CE399, the bullet found at the hospital that supposedly is the bullet that did all this damage. And then on the far right is CE556, which is a bullet that was fired into a cadaver wrist and it was badly damaged. This proved that the bullet, if CE399 was the bullet that hit Kennedy and Connolly, it would have to have slowed down greatly. But there's a problem with this in that it didn't create very much damage in Kennedy's neck, so they had to try to explain it all, and they really couldn't. The wrist damage was very minor, and it was indicative of a bullet that had been slowed greatly. And this is all over Olivier's testimony. And this is something that they warned Specter and the Warren Commission couldn't quite come to terms with. And so they ended up fudging things a little bit. And we'll show that in a second. Well, here it is, fun with math. Yeah, when you go back and you add up all the velocities lost in the various wounds, and you come back with a bullet that's not even a full velocity bullet. It's roughly a subsonic bullet traveling at lower than the speed of sound, which is what the CIA's manual on assassination suggests to use in assassination attempts, strangely enough. But so the Warren Commission got around this by a loophole, so to speak, because Dr. Olivier had said that the bullet would lose more velocity if it was traveling sideways when it hit Connolly. And so then the Warren report, they changed his testimony to say substantially more velocity than 400 feet. And but his actual testimony had been he couldn't say how much velocity. And this was a big problem for Olivier's protege, Larry Sturtevant, who testified for the HSCA. He also couldn't get his numbers to add up. And then in 2005, he wrote a book called the JFK Myths. And his book was full of them. And he ended up saying that the bullet that hit Connolly's chest actually lost up perhaps as much as 1,480 feet per second. And that much of this velocity was lost before the bullet even hit Connolly's rib. Crazy. Anyhow, so why do people still believe in this? Well, the HSCA, which reinvestigated the case in the 1970s, they wanted all the science to add up. And the first scientist they consulted was a nuclear physicist named Dr. Vincent Gwynn, and he studied the wrist fragment from Connolly and the CE399, and he concluded that they were from the wrist fragment came from the bullet, came from the magic bullet, and therefore the single bullet theory had some validity. But when you look at his actual results, he was just blowing smoke. He also compared the skull fragments, some fragments from the brain, and those fragments had a lot more similarity, 4 fragments, than the CE399 and the wrist fragment. And then when you look at his professional papers, you realize he changed his numbers. With the numbers he gave the HSCA had a lot of variation in silver, which is one of the only elements you could get to match, but it really wasn't a close match. And then when he submitted his results to his peers, he changed the numbers to make it much closer, much more similar. Anyhow, but the HSCA got a few things right. They figured out that it was a back wound and not a neck wound, and they published a drawing, which was a tracing of the autopsy photo. And then HSCA's doctors and experts in their statements indicated that they thought this back wound was actually lower than the throat wound on the body, which means in order for the single bullet theory to work, Kennedy would have to be leaning even further forward than proposed by the Warren Commission. And this came to a head in September 1978 when Dr. Michael Bodden testified before the HSCA, and he said that the drawings created for the Warren Commission showed the back wound 2 inches too high, and he brought a drawing in of his own showing Kennedy leaning very far forward at the time of the shots. But 5 days later, Mr. Thomas Kenny from NASA was the trajectory expert. He moved the back wound back up. So what was going on here? Well, in the footnotes of the HSC report, it explains that Thomas Canning was given full free rein to move the back wound. And sure enough, you can see why when you look at the medical drawings and you realize that where the doctors placed the back wound overlay the first rib. And so then you look at Thomas Canning's drawings and he moved the back wound up over the rib just because. Anyhow, but to show that he's disingenuous all the way around, he also proposed that Kennedy was leaning further forward when he shot in the back than when he was shot in the head, the opposite of what's shown in the Zapruder film. And this is something which I came across, which I'm been very surprised that no one else ever figured it out before. But his report is written in such language that it makes it very difficult to figure out what he's talking about. But that's exactly what he said, that Kennedy was leaning forward and then got shot, and then sat up and got shot in the head. But there's another problem where the doctors moved the exit location for the bullet for the head wound, and this created a problem for him because they moved it to a wider part of the skull, which would change the horizontal trajectory leaning back to the sniper's nest, so it no longer pointed towards the sniper's nest, but would point towards the Daltex building across the street. So he just changed the skull dimensions and shrunk the skull. And he also took pictures in order to establish the position of Kennedy at frame 313 of the Zapruder film. He took pictures of dolls. He called them anthropomorphic reenactments or something like that. But he took pictures of dolls, which supposedly recreated Kennedy's position at frame 312 and 313. But a close look at frame 312 compared to the pictures of the dolls that he took show that it's not remotely close. Anyhow, but nevertheless, Professor Robert Blakey, who ran the HSA investigation, still stands by the trajectory analysis. In fact, as time has passed, the single bullet theory has become more like a religion than a scientific theory to be tested. It has its true believers who are truly blind to its failings. The high priest of this religion is Dr. John Lattimer, who was the first outside expert allowed to view the autopsy materials, and he came out and said that the back wound was actually higher up than shown in the Rydberg drawings, and it was actually at the level of Kennedy's chin. And he believed in this so much that even after the HSCA published their drawings showing it was on the back, he still claimed he was correct and that the bullet entered at the level of the chin. One can only guess then that Dr. Lattimer was either lying or insane. But he's far from alone. Professor John McAdams, who's been christened an expert on the assassination by much of the media, also believes that the bullet entered way up on the neck, but he won't admit it. So he claims that the photo on the left in this exhibit matches up with the drawing on the right, rather than what is obvious, the photo in the middle is what actually matches up. Anyhow, and then there's the animator Dale Myers, who's won awards for his animation proving the single bullet theory in the eyes of some people. Anyhow, Dale Myers has the bullet enter the proper location of the clothing, but then when you look at his website, you see he also has the bullet enter high up on the neck and not on the actual location in the back wound, because evidently he also can't figure out how to make it all work. And then there's so much so that Nova, the program Nova in 2013, just forgot it. They just threw it out. They just didn't even care. They had the bullet enter into Kennedy's collar on the back of the neck, and they used that as an exhibit to demonstrate the single bullet theory, knowing full well that the bullet didn't enter there and didn't enter the clothes there, and that they were just lying, and they're just brazen. And I want to put an end to these lies, which is why I've created this presentation, and please help me pass the word. I thank you for your patience.